everyone, and welcome to this Arcview Access webinar. Thank you for joining and choosing to spend your time with us this afternoon. Today, we are going to be diving into the world of vape hardware inside of the cannabis industry. My name is Derek Champoux. I am the Vice President of Brand and Marketing at Greentank Technologies. We are an innovative tech company that designs, engineers, and manufactures current and next-gen vape hardware. I have the absolute pleasure of being your host and moderator for this webinar. I am extremely excited to jump into some great discussion with some rock star studded panel, who I will introduce shortly. To kick things off, I thought I would dive into some data so we can fully understand where the current cannabis vape market is today. Greentank, alongside with Arcview and Headset, recently put out the most comprehensive quarterly vape report in the market that dives into Q1 2021 vape sales. And we really identified some really interesting trends, both in new emerging markets and in mature markets. So I'm going to share my screen. We're going to dive into just a little glimpse into the vape report, so we can check out some of the growth in the vape space over the past year. So just give me a second here. All right. Hopefully everyone can see my screen here. First off, we can look at the largest legal cannabis market in the world, obviously California, the Golden State. This is an incredible stat. The Golden State surpassed $1 billion in cannabis vape sales for the first time in 2020, and is already showing signs of outperforming last year's totals through the first 3 months of 2021. In Q1 of this year, sales in California rose 22.6% from the same quarter in 2020, but it's the total units sold here, an increase of 33% from the same time period last year. That really has us excited. It's an absolutely monster number coming out of California, and vapes are continuing to drive sales in the cannabis market inside of California. Next up, I want to take a look at Colorado. The state posted its second best quarter on record to begin the year, outperforming its Q1 2020 sales by a total of 31%. The revenue bump wasn't the result of total units sold, which only rose about 300,000 units from the year earlier. It was mainly due to the meteoric rise in popularity of 1 gram units, which increased to 38% of all cannabis vape sales from 15% in Q1 2020. So we're seeing huge sales in popularity in the 1 grams out of Colorado. And the final market that I want to quickly dive into is Ontario, Canada. Across the board, the Canadian sales in 2021 have seen an absolutely massive increase in sales, and there is a reason for this. There is context behind this number and the incredible jump here that you're seeing. Cannabis legalization 2.0 went live at the end of 2019 into Q1 2020, which included the sales of edibles, oils, vape hardware, etc. And there was naturally a ramping up period during the first quarter last year. But as we can see in Q1 2021, the sales number, the vape category is alive and well, with close to 40 million in sales in the first quarter. The big trend indicator in Ontario and other markets inside of Canada is the beginning of what we think will be the dominant vape SKU in 2021, which is the full 1 gram cartridge. We've already seen this increase by 16% in Ontario alone, and I personally predict that we'll see these larger tank sizes being the majority of sales by the end of this year. So I know I just quickly ran through a few markets here, just very briefly, but if you'd like to see more of this type of data, you can download the full Q1 2021 vape report for free over at greentanktech.com, and includes a breakdown of 9 key markets in North America. So again, you can go over, download this for free at greentanktech.com. We'll also be hosting a breakout session after the webinar for anyone that's interested in diving a little bit deeper into the numbers. If you guys have questions, we can go over all of that in a breakout session after the webinar. Hopefully some of you can stick around. We'd really appreciate that. All right, I'm going to stop sharing my screen here because I think we should move on and get our panelists in here. So we can talk about the state of vape a little bit more in depth. So I'll introduce everyone one by one, and they will give you a short 10 to 15 second background about themselves, and then we'll get into some topics. So if the panelists can start turning on their cameras. Excellent. I think we got everyone in here. Perfect. Okay. Without further ado, our first panelist is David Wright, Chief Revenue Officer over at Greentank. David, thanks for joining us, and a little introduction about yourself.
Yeah, no, thank you, Derek. And as Derek mentioned, Chief Revenue Officer at Greentank Technologies. I oversee sales, marketing, customer success, and play a pretty heavy hand in the operations of our business. So really excited to be here and talk about the trends we're seeing throughout vape in North America.
Awesome. Thanks, Dave. Appreciate it. Next up, we have Tracy Gallegos, a partner over at Duane Morris. Thanks for joining us today, Tracy. A little introduction on yourself.
Thanks, Derek. Hi, everyone. I'm Tracy Gallegos. I'm, like Derek said, a partner in the corporate group at Duane Morris, also one of the co-team leads of the firm's cannabis industry group. I've been in the cannabis space since 2010, primarily doing corporate and real estate transactions, as well as regulatory compliance and licensing. So thanks, everyone, for joining us. I'm excited to be here.
Awesome. Thanks, Tracy. Appreciate it. Next up, we have Gary Seelhorst, Senior Vice President, Compliance and Government Affairs over at Justice Grown and Justice Cannabis Co. Gary, thanks for joining us. A little intro on yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Derek. Like Derek said, VP of Compliance and Government Affairs. Justice Grown is a multi-state operator, vertical in 8 different states. I've been in the industry for about 3 years. Come from the pharmaceutical industry and never look back. I'm really happy to be part of this panel. Thanks.
Awesome. Good to have you, Gary. Appreciate it. Next up, we have Neeraj Bhardwaj, President and founder of Loto Labs. Neeraj, thanks for joining us. A little intro on yourself.
Yeah, hey, thanks for having me. So Loto Labs was founded by crowdfunding in 2014. Since that time, we built the world's first induction vaporizers, and we hold the patent on induction vaporizing and temperature control for induction vaporizers. So, yeah, nice to meet you guys.
Thanks, Raj. Appreciate it. Next up, we have David Abernathy, Principal at Arcview Management. David was actually a key part in the Q1 2021 Industry Vape Report that we put together. It was awesome collaborating with David. But David, thanks for joining the panel. Really appreciate it. A little introduction into yourself.
Thanks. As Derek mentioned, I'm principal at Arcview Management Consulting. I help run our consulting firm as well as Arcview Market Research. And I've been in the cannabis industry now for about 12 years. And in addition to my work with Arcview Management Consulting, I also sit on the boards of the Arcview Group, Amsterdam University, the Marijuana Policy Project, Minority Cannabis Business Association, as well as some organizations outside of the cannabis industry, and really great to be here. I love talking about cannabis and data, so this should be a good show.
Excellent. Thanks, David. Appreciate it. And last but certainly not least, we have Jocelyn Sheltraw, Director of Industry Relations at Headset. Headset was a huge part in the Vape Report, and we're so thrilled to be working with them on the data side. But Jocelyn, thanks for joining us here today. Can you give a little introduction into yourself?
Yeah, what's happening, everyone? Dialing in from sunny Southern California. Happy to be here. I've been a part of the cannabis industry for 3 years now, having the time of my life, spent the prior 10 years working in tech with a bunch of app developers. And in this 3 years, I've just become deeply entrenched in the community. I sit on a bunch of different associations working on equity programs, obviously sharing a lot of what we're learning from Headset's end. And then in my personal life, my partner is one of the co-founders of Guild Extracts, a legacy brand in California. So I'm just like learning all of the things that we're learning from Headset's end on the data side, watching my partner build this like legacy brand and seeing all the challenges that he's been going through with that. And then just learning across all of these different, 11 different markets that we're in for Headset, being involved in those associations. So I'm happy to share the boots on the ground knowledge that we're learning, as well as all these incredible insights from Headset's end. So happy to be here.
Perfect. Thanks, Jocelyn. Yeah, incredible. That's the panel. Incredible panel today. So there will be a Q&A session at the end. So I believe you can submit questions throughout, and we will get to them a little bit later in the webinar. But for now, I think we're going to jump into some discussion. And the first thing I want to talk about with our panel is the current state of vape inside of the cannabis industry. Yeah, what are some current vape trends that you've observed over the last year, maybe 2 years, and why do you think the market has kind of shifted in that direction? This could be sales related, technology related, from a legal trends perspective. What are some of the current trends you're seeing inside of different vape markets? And I think to kick things off, I think I'm going to kick it over to Dave Wright.
Yeah, no, thanks, Derek. So from a trend standpoint, I think we've seen stuff tied to everything you just mentioned, from a legality standpoint, a region standpoint, an ease of use standpoint. Some of the major trends that we've noticed over the past couple of years is this shift from the disposable market into the cartridge market. A big piece of that is driven by the environmental side of things. And as you mentioned at the beginning, tied to the Vape Report, we're seeing this huge growth in the 1 gram popularity of cartridges. I think that's also driven by a lot of price compression, as well as margins on the actual brand side, may that be the MSO, the single state operator, or the licensed producer. We're also seeing users get, quite frankly, truly starting to enjoy and figure out the brands that they want to work with or use, sorry. And because of that, they're more apt to spend a couple extra dollars on a larger tank size versus at the very beginning, there was a lot of bouncing around between different brands. So we're starting to see some brand loyalty at the user level. That's translating and starting to drive some of the sales as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Jocelyn, on the Headset side, you're dealing with data and you're dealing with trends, day in, day out. Over the last couple of years, leading up to the current state of where we are today, have you really found anything interesting, any trends that you think are noteworthy?
Yeah, I mean, listen, you touched on a lot of them at the beginning, Derek, when you were kind of going through the different markets. First, I just want to say, mad respect for anyone creating a vape product. This is a very challenging category to build a product in. It's faced a lot of challenges over the last couple of years. And in particular, we are seeing a couple different things. Well, through the last year, we made it out of the vape crisis. So yay to everyone who made it through. That was not an easy challenge to get through, as we're all seeing regulations and policies are changing in real time. Every state or every province operates different, which is then going to have a different impact on how sales are doing in that state or that province. So as you mentioned, being that I'm in California, the things that I'll call out here, we did $1 billion in vape sales in 2020. That's massive. That's incredible. And that's coming out of the vape crisis. So we did initially see across all markets a dip in sales. Obviously, consumers, as we're seeing a lot of media attention around the vape crisis, there was a lot of confusion around if these products were safe or not. So naturally, there was a bit of a dip there. Sales have rebounded. We're seeing in every market, per the report that we just did, all legal market sales are growing for the vape category. And the big shift here is in that 1 gram package size. This has been really challenging for a lot of producers. You're pivoting your business, right? And you're having to get this hardware is coming from China. So through the pandemic, that was really challenging to get some of the hardware for a lot of these producers. So that certainly had an impact on some of the producers' businesses. We have seen in general prices are going down. I think there's a lot more competition that's coming in market. And as I'm in the field talking to producers all throughout, the US and Canada, it really is this emergence of like a good, better, best pricing. And I'll use the phrase, I guess, a race to the bottom in some sense. You're seeing a lot of adjustments with pricing because there is more competition, which is reason why you need to be really thinking critically about what kind of segment or you're going to play in. So are you going to be a value brand? Are you going for that luxury premium brand, and really understanding what the market looks like there? And then, the rise of the 1 gram package sizes. Obviously, people weren't wanting to make as many trips during the pandemic, so that certainly caused a shift there. And then our team actually just finished this analysis looking at extraction type. And so one thing I would call out here that's been particularly interesting to look at for California is live resin. Live resin is becoming a much more common extraction type here in California. Most other markets, it's dominated by distillate. So this is something that I think other states are going to want to be looking at.
Big time. I could not agree more, especially about the type of extraction. We're starting to see that in market with a lot of our brands as well. It's incredible. Once that trend starts shifting, it does not stop, and it waves over into other markets as well. Gary, I know you're working with many different states at Justice Grown. Have you seen differences in different markets, in different trends inside of those markets, whether they're emerging markets or they're more mature markets?
Yeah, well, so kind of depends on which state you're in. If it's a medical state, they usually try to keep things fairly well controlled as far as the dosing, and that's for obvious reasons. So that's typically what we'll see. So we're in Utah, Missouri, and Pennsylvania, places like that. Some of the gummies are a little bit more popular because I think the dosing around it is a little bit more predictive. And then as things move to sort of the transition into the adult use market, that's when you see vape sales, I think, ramping up quite a bit as from a market perspective. I'm not saying that it's non-existent from the medical market. I think it's just easier for regulators to get their head around the dosing around the therapeutic value of cannabis. And it's a way for them to get a little bit more comfortable with the idea of treatment with cannabis. So that's really kind of what we're seeing right now.
Yeah, I agree. From the legal side, Tracy, I'm really curious to hear this from your perspective on a legal side. Any trends that you've seen, because I'm always thinking about it from we know the mature, established markets like Colorado and California and everything that they've gone through, but now that we're on the tipping point of a lot more of these states coming online, what do you think they need to know now, coming online from a legal perspective in terms of trends that we're seeing in the industry?
Well, I think states that are just coming online have to be prepared for a lot of confusion, right? As Jocelyn said earlier, every state, every local jurisdiction has a different way that they're going to be dealing with vapes, how they're going to, regulate them, test them, so forth and so on. And right now, there's no standard across the board that anyone entering into the market can look to, right? I mean, there's all these questions about, emissions testing and, known additives and known toxins that nobody really knows what to do about because every jurisdiction is taking a different position. For example, there's emissions testing required for, I think in Europe and Canada, for nicotine products, right? And I think only one state may be considering that, and that's not going to happen until 2022. And I think that state may be Colorado. So there's really nothing to look to in terms of how vapes are going to be treated across the board. Everyone's doing their own thing. So I think for new entrants, looking to established markets like California, Oregon, Colorado, I don't know that it will be particularly helpful because it's not, they might get some guidance in terms of what those states are doing, but at the end of the day, what that particular jurisdiction or local jurisdiction wants to do may be completely different than what the bigger established markets are already doing.
Yeah, I agree. And, it's funny, we call markets like California and Colorado and some of these states that have been online, close to 10 years now as these mature markets. But in the grand scheme of things, this whole industry is in its infancy. It's still, immature, and we're still all kind of growing and learning together. So that's interesting. Yeah. Neeraj, I'm curious on your side, from a engineering and innovation side, what are some of the current trends that you're seeing in the market right now?
Yeah. So what we're seeing a lot of is people are using disposables. They throw away your vaporizer at the end of it when the coil breaks. Um, People are still searching for hardware. They're still searching for something that works really differently than what's on the market right now. And one of the good things I've seen recently has been the porous ceramic C-cell type of arrangement. That's an interesting arrangement for the wick and the coil system as well. So we're seeing a lot of changes, a lot of in the vape space, things like Bluetooth and bells and whistles on vaporizers. You see that with the cartridges that are red and they tell you what's going on with the materials. So a lot of things like that the consumers are really interacting more with their vaporizers more than just a use and then throw away.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very true. And David, I would love your wealth of experience and working with all these great organizations. Your take on some of the current trends that you're seeing inside of the vape markets.
Yeah, I think there are quite a few interesting things going on and that have gone on recently. The vape crisis was a real, at first, a big source of confusion for consumers. And a lot of states reacted to that in ways that were counterproductive. In the end, we saw that the vape crisis was largely driven by unregulated producers, and we saw things like the state of Massachusetts banning all vape sales, which essentially drove anybody looking for vape cartridges to the illicit market, which was the source of the problem in the first place. I think that a lot of people learned what was going on through that, and ultimately there were probably folks who were sourcing their vape cartridges from the unregulated market prior to the vape cartridge who switched over to the legal market as a result of that. So I think it was a tough time, but hopefully both states and consumers learned quite a bit from that experience. Touching on what Jocelyn brought up about pricing, that's a really huge point. We see in cannabis, folks, a lot of consumers are still sort of looking for the highest possible potency at the lowest possible price, which is really an artifact of illicit drug markets. This is the kind of purchasing behavior we see in illicit drug markets and not the kind of purchasing behavior we tend to see in legal drug markets. So if you look at something like alcohol, during Prohibition, it shifted to that. What's the strongest alcohol I can get for the lowest possible price? But as it legalized and as consumers matured, we don't see that sort of behavior. There are a few consumers who buy the strongest alcohol they can get at the cheapest price, but typically that is not the thing that consumers are using as their decision calculus when they're looking to buy an alcohol product. Coffee went through a similar evolution, even though it wasn't illegal. Consumers were still getting used to coffee for a long time, and it was good coffee was strong coffee, right? That they were one and the same. But as the consumer's tastes matured, consumers aren't looking for the cheapest possible coffee they can get or the strongest possible coffee they can get. They're taking into account all sorts of other things, that how well the brand resonates with them, the taste, the whether it's fair trade, where in the world it comes from, to make these purchasing decisions. And as cannabis markets mature, I suspect that we'll see a lot more of that complexity and a lot more brands really, as Jocelyn mentioned, having to figure out exactly where they play in that. Are they going to be a low-cost, high-volume producer? Or are they going to be a much higher quality producer? And that's interesting to watch sort of happen in real time.
Yeah, we're seeing that in many different markets up here in Canada as well, which is really interesting that you brought that up. Really good point. And so I want to shift gears because I've heard this, brought up a couple times so far around, VapeGate or the Volley or Vape Scare. The vape space has had arguably the most obstacles to overcome over the last few years out of, I believe, like any cannabis product category. We had, heavy metal concerns early on with poorly sourced, materials from lower tiered manufacturers. We had, vape scare, which was a volley, which hit the, David mentioned the more of the illegal vape market with serious, health concerns around unregulated additives. And we'll certainly continue to touch on vape safety in a bit. But this year, a controversial bill was passed that targeted the distribution and logistics of electronic cigarettes, also known as the PACT Act. And for those who don't know, the PACT Act is the Prevent All Cigarette Trafficking Act. And the purpose of the bill is something that I think that all the panelists and all the viewers can agree on. It's, to prevent the sale and shipment of tobacco products, including e-cigarettes, to minors. Pretty straightforward. However, in my personal opinion, the bill was perhaps poorly written and perhaps intentionally vague. And it lumped in legal cannabis vaporizers, which, meant carriers like USPS, FedEx, UPS, started halting all shipments of vape hardware, no matter what industry you're in, on the business to consumer side, the business to business side. My question to the panelists is, with the impending PACT Act looming, how do you think this will affect the U.S. market, and how do you think companies will cope when dealing across state lines? And I would really love to kick this off with Tracy. I would love to hear your opinion around the PACT Act.
Well, one of the things is I don't believe, and other panelists, correct me if I'm wrong, I think that the USPS walked back its initial decision that it was going to stop, because I think that the problem was, like you said, Derek, they lumped in all electronic nicotine delivery systems into the definition of cigarettes under the PACT Act. And I think that there was the USPS halted the decision to stop shipping because of a potential conflict with the Tobacco Control Act, which some of you probably know that the Tobacco Control Act is enforced by the FDA. And the FDA's interpretation of what should be encompassed in the definition of cigarettes and tobacco does not include vape products that, including, oils, distillates that have CBD or THC. So I think that the USPS is still doing shipments. PACT Act doesn't require FedEx or UPS to stop, but I think they're doing it. I think we were having a discussion earlier, Gary, where, probably for PR purposes, these other common carriers decided not to go ahead and ship them. So that was kind of the long intro to the answer I'm going to give you. I actually don't think there's going to be a huge long-term impact on it. I mean, the PACT Act is going to require certain registration and reporting requirements, as well as some requirements in terms of delivery. Like, you have to label the package that it has a tobacco product. And you have to have somebody, you have to be able to verify their age and identity, and they have to sign off on it when they receive it. So I don't really think that that's going to have a huge impact, particularly because the PACT Act does have that B2B exception. So for, the manufacturers of hardware or cannabis products that go in the hardware, I think they still will be able to ship to one another. It's just going to have an impact on being able to ship to consumers. So I don't think it's going to have a huge deal. And in terms of being able to ship directly to consumers, I think that there are some shipping companies right out there that are looking for are providing alternatives like Easy Ship. I don't know how reliable they are, but I know they are a shipping platform where they connect, consumers to possible couriers. And then in some locations, maybe the seller is able to use a local company to get its product, so it's not going across state lines. So at the end of the day, I really don't think that the PACT Act is going to have a massive impact on the industry long term.
Yeah.
Fingers crossed. Sorry, Dave, I was going to actually pass it over to you. I'm really curious on your side what you think of the PACT Act.
Well, it's funny because I tend to agree with Tracy, but if you asked me 4 or 5 months ago, I would have said the complete opposite. It was kind of around the March timeline where we looked at it as a business at Greentank, and it was a bit of panic, not only for us, but many of our competitors and a lot of people in the vape space. As we rolled into April, there was even more ambiguity around what you were allowed to do and what you weren't able to do. And I think it caused a bit of confusion for the end brands, be that the MSO, the single state operator, or the licensed producer that was working south of the border. And on our end, I think as that time has passed, we've seen seen some continuity to shipping, but we have seen it slow down. We saw a bit of a spike in shipping prices around the time of March and April, just due to the PACT Act and a bit of the scare. But as we've kind of moved on from the initial release of that, the amendment made to that, I think we're starting to see some normalcy come back to the industry. There's still some ambiguity around what can and can't be done at the consumer level, but from a B2B standpoint, we definitely felt that that effect for probably about 3 to 6 weeks. We've seen it lighten a little bit since then, and quite frankly, we're still seeing shipments made by DHL, UPS, and FedEx. But with that came a bit of a price hike, which obviously gets passed on and hits our customers, the end user, and everybody throughout the supply chain. So it has been interesting to follow. And I know, Gary, we've spoken at this at length around just all the hoops you have to jump through, the different governing bodies you need to register with. So it still needs to be done. It's about checking some of the boxes to make sure that you can keep your supply chain flowing. So it's been interesting. But yeah, as I said, if you asked me 6 months ago, as we were kind of coming into this, I would have been on the opposite end of the spectrum. But over the past month or so, I've definitely jumped into Tracy's boat there and tend to agree.
Yeah, I think we've definitely seen kind of like we're in limbo, but I think we're starting to see kind of that light at the end of the tunnel. Gary, on your side, dealing with Justice Grown, were you guys kind of in the same boat when the PACT Act was initially released? Was there kind of that like, whoa, what are we going to do now factor?
Yeah, there was a lot of confusion, I think, about what was going to happen in the interpretation of the amendment. So again, this is an amendment to the PACT Act.
Yeah.
And so I talk to legislators all day long. And this is kind of one of those instances where, it's like back when the Patriot Act came out. Are you for or against the Patriot Act? So it's kind of like, are you for or against trafficking cigarettes to minors? Of course you're going to say, no, I don't want to do that. But they didn't realize so this is the response that we're going to take. And it was the same thing with UPS, FedEx, and DHL. Yeah, we're going to follow suit as well, just because of, the PR component. The reality is this is actually going to sort of quell in a normal sense in no time, I think. And we didn't really see a whole lot of a direct effect, but it was more just sort of like okay, let's hang on for a second. Let's figure out what the interpretation is of the amendment, and then we'll just kind of go from there. And there were, I think, David, you talked about a price spike. There was definitely a price spike. That's probably going to come down as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, sorry, David, did I cut you off there?
This is a really interesting one. I think we saw this coming pretty early and sent messages to some of our clients in the space who might be affected. And I totally agree. There was a lot of confusion and concern at the beginning. We've seen this a lot with legislators passing bills that regulating things that they don't fully understand. We've seen it certainly a lot in cannabis at the state level with regulatory policies that don't kind of jive with reality. And we've seen it a lot outside of the cannabis industry as regulators grapple with new technologies that appear and end up putting in place legislation that has unintended consequences or in some cases is counterproductive. I think people are figuring out their ways around this now and registering. There is a lot of hesitancy among cannabis companies in the U.S. to register with a federal law enforcement agency, the ATF. At least it's not the DEA that you have to register with to receive these component shipments. But it certainly, these are the kinds of challenges that we constantly see in the cannabis industry as legislators and regulators fumbling around in the dark trying to create policies around the industry.
Yeah, I agree. Neeraj, I'm curious on your side at Loto Labs, if the PACT Act really, affected you guys, or if you guys were kind of like looking at it from the outside in, or were you, kind of concerned about it?
We were concerned about it. They, our 3PL wrote to us, our third-party logistics company wrote to us and said, "This is coming. This is going to happen. Is this going to affect you? And how are you guys going to get around it?" And basically, So there's a couple different things. For us, it doesn't really affect us. I mean, nothing ever slowed down for our company shipping the product that we have right now in the market. But also for cannabis vapes that are filled with cannabis, this won't affect that market either because they still have to be bought in America at a dispensary, also in Canada, but it has to be bought at a dispensary. So that won't affect that. It's only for open vaping systems that we like ours, where you can put anything inside of it, that was going to be hindered by direct-to-consumer retail directly. But the way around this has been, I think there's going to be a vacuum if this were to happen for real. As Tracy mentioned, I don't think this is actually going to go into effect. But if there were a power vacuum, I think something like an Uber for this type of thing would take over from, say, 3PLs to the consumers and things like that. I think that there's a power vacuum would get created because there's so much shipping involved. Yeah, but for us, to answer your question, it didn't really affect us too much.
Yeah, and hopefully it doesn't. But knock on wood. Jocelyn, I'm curious on your opinion on the PACT Act. I know it doesn't directly involve headset in any way, but it does affect the cannabis industry. And you just being involved in the cannabis industry, I'm sure you've obviously heard about the PACT Act. Any final words on that?
Yeah, I think this is something we all need to be looking at very closely. I think, okay, right now, if you're a vape manufacturer in this industry, and if you are not very well capitalized because things are changing so quickly from the policy perspective, repackaging laws, all of these things, it is really hard to run a profitable business, let alone having to deal with how do I get on a shelf? How do I manage retail distribution? Like, this is very, very hard to run, a vape business. But here's the thing that I think we need to be thinking about as an industry, because we have an opportunity to really, shift this now. When I'm looking at the consumer trends of how younger generations, which is really at the core of the concern with this act, it's about young people and how they're consuming cannabis. So I want to read something because Colorado last year put out a study, and it was the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, and they were looking at young people. They wanted to know the health and well-being of young people in middle school and high school. And so they asked them a bevy different questions, how they think about their cannabis consumption, alcohol, suicide, all of these different things about health and well-being. And here's what we need to be thinking about as an industry. So in 2019, 20% of youth in Colorado said that they'd used marijuana compared to 19% just a year prior. So marginal change, very, very little. Here's where the big change comes into play. It's with vaping and it's with dabbing. So in 2019, 10.6% of this group of students, or these groups of kids, had been vaping compared to 5% in 2017, just a few years prior. Now, dabbing rose from 4.3% in 2015 to 20.4% in 2019. So what I'm thinking is listen, I'm seeing it in the data. Young people, for the first time over summer, we saw Gen Z. Flower sales have always been the largest category of sales for every demographic group. Young people, they're choosing vapes. That means we have to be very conscious. We don't know what we don't know about this industry yet. That's why we're seeing everything with the vape crisis, different additives. The technology is changing because of the way we need to heat these devices. We do not know enough yet. So I know this may not be the popular opinion amongst a lot of, cannabis vape producers, which I very much, like I said, my guy's running a vape company. I relate. I see the struggle. It is hard meeting margins. It's hard being profitable, especially if you're not really well capitalized. But the trends with younger people, this is how they're choosing to consume. And we need to look at that very closely. We need to protect these future generations. And I just think we really need to be looking at this. And that is how they're preferring to consume. So it's a hard thing to look at.
Yeah, that's some incredible data, which, this is actually a perfect segue into what I wanted to get into next. And you were talking about, the next generation, the future of cannabis consumption and what that kind of looks like. So, one of the last things I wanted to ask the panelists is, what are some exciting trends that you would love to see eventually come out of the vape space in the future? Where do you see the vape space evolving? Either from a tech standpoint, from a safety and regulations perspective, on the legal side, what's the next generation of vape? What's the future of vape? And I'm actually really curious, Gary, we were talking about from like a standardization and regulatory standpoint, and I think, we both agreed that that's kind of where it's going. Could you touch on that a little bit, on where you think that side of the industry is going in the future?
Yeah, so the reality is, if you're a testing lab, an operator, manufacturer, or regulator, and you're not willing to engage in dialogue, you're just going to get left behind. As you mentioned, Derek, this is a nascent industry, and there's more and more data that's becoming available, and it's evolving live time. And we're talking about heating tech, dosing, resistance. So you take a company like Greentank, who's very tech heavy. They have their own in-house lab as well, and they're doing a lot of dialogue with a lot of folks as they're starting to evolve their product. If you're not a company like that going forward, I think you're just not going to be part of the discussion. So these testing standards need to be, like you said, they need to be standardized across all the states. And if you're not part of the solution, then I think you're just going to, like I said, you're just not going to be relevant in a lot of this technology going forward.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think there needs to be, at some point in the very near future, some sort of standard for safety tests, and that goes, above and beyond vape. It needs to, cover all of, cannabis, consumption products. But I completely agree. Neeraj, I'm really curious from your perspective. We've always talked about, next gen vape technology and innovation. I'm curious, from your point of view, where do you see, vape going in the future?
So I'll tell you that one of the things that I see is that for heating technology for vaping, it needs to be a narrower temperature range, and that's very important for the future. We need to have better understanding of what the materials and temperature do to aerosol. And dose controls, we've mentioned that already. And I would say it needs to be done properly and verifiably. We need to avoid claims that can't be backed up. One of the changes right now or challenges right now in the cannabis is that it affects people differently in different ways. So one day we may get to a point where genetic testing could be part of the cannabis product for an individual. But in the meantime, there's a possibility that widespread data collection with user consent and careful anonymization could really help match people with cannabis strains. And dosage could be a big part of that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's been so much talk, not recently, but like over the past couple of years around dose control, especially in the vape industry and properly. I forget who it was. Was it David Abernathy was talking about, from a medical market, more so on the edible side, being able to accurately dose and something that I think definitely needs to, come to the forefront, especially in the vape industry. But Jocelyn, I'm curious about your opinion on this. From a headset perspective, diving into the data, putting on your predictive hat for the future of vape. Where do you kind of see the industry going here?
I'm gonna answer this, I guess, in terms of the data side, like I was mentioning, and I'm gonna pop it into the chat box here, looking at the extraction types. So we're seeing this shift in live resin. I think people are really being more conscious of what's actually in their vape products. There's still a lot of consumer education that needs to happen here. We saw this when the vape crisis first hit. That's when you saw some brands coming forward and be like, hey, we're only using natural terpenes. We're not using any additive flavors. This is an opportunity for brands to really come forward and talk to the consumer about how you make these products. If we think about the evolution of technology on the hardware side just over the last 5 years, it's like everything started in this industry with the metal coils. You were using metal in the hardware. Then we learned the producers had to go through and they had to test things like, hey, I need to see how this, if I left this vape cartridge in my car for a few day period, what does that do to the product? You have to test it in these situations that no one really knows, right? Because we're learning in real time. And then we had this shift into the ceramic products. That's what we're seeing a lot of today. And now, actually this week, I was just meeting with a company that they're using laser beams. So this is all about how do we heat the product? We don't know what we don't know yet, again, and because terpenes, it's very dependent on the heat, right? They're volatile organic compounds. And so what happens in the chamber of the cart when it heats up, there's a lot that we're still learning here. So the science, the technology, I don't know how to answer this question yet, other than we need to look very closely and test situations that we might not, like these odd situations, the example of like testing it in your car if you're leaving it behind. Like we have to think about these things in that way.
Yeah. I think it goes back to that, standardization of testing as well. The regulation side. I know Dave, Wright, just unmuted. He wants to jump in on this, but we're constantly talking about this too. I brought it up before around like the heavy metals and all that stuff. I think we're trending towards more pure, more cleaner vapor or just cannabis consumption products in general. Dave, I know you kind of wanted to jump in there.
Yeah, well, it's interesting, right? Because I agree with everybody there in the sense of standardization across just the different ways that vapes need to be tested needs to come to the forefront. You see different testing standards in California versus Colorado versus Michigan versus Canada, and none of them really speak to one another. To get consistent tests, you need to test with multiple different labs and then cross-reference the data to make sure that your hardware is clean and passes in what I believe are more of the stringent states, being Michigan at this point in time. I saw a comment in the chat as we were listening to some of the panelists speak on the emission side. So that's something that will hopefully come to the forefront, and again, needs more standardization around it. And from a Greentank perspective, it's why we're focused on the next gen hardware, right? You're seeing the actual industry right now heavily dominated by ceramic and ceramic cores. And similar to some conversations I've had with Neeraj, it needs to be better than that, right? And what we've been doing is through our R&D license, really pushing forward to figure out what is that next heating technology. How do we drive for a cleaner, safer vape and help actually set the standards around what those definite testing procedures need to be. So on our end, it really comes down to standardized testing. It needs to be cleaner, safer, giving folks an alternative to actually pick the brand based on that. So on our end, that's how we see it. Neeraj, I see you about to jump in there. Joe.
All I wanted to say was that I think the industry should be seen to be ahead of the game, measure and inform itself and users before regulation is passed from the outside, right? At the moment, there's a real need for more testing and ideally standardization of that testing. And when we're talking about testing, Loto labs, for example, we're having to collaborate with analytical labs to investigate protocols for aerosol testing. Now, standardized testing is probably a controversial thing because it will have the potential to negatively impact some of the members of the industry. But we need to realize that negative health outcomes will way far greater than that and come to light. Just look at Juul, which now faces the existential threats. And ideally, we would form an industry group along the lines of the Caresta method, which is for tobacco, and its emphasis on science, which includes establishing protocols for testing. That's what I want to say.
I just want to add one thing to on top of what everyone is saying about standardization. I do think that's going to happen sometime soon, but I think the states and local jurisdictions are walking a very fine line, because if we start putting in these regulations regarding testing, standardization, that then will increase the cost of compliance for the manufacturers, and that cost may more than likely be passed on to the consumer. And if that happens, if increased testing standardization causes the price of the product to rise, that may have the unintended consequence of having consumers turn back to the illicit market, which is what started this problem in the first place. So I think that may be a reason why the states are moving a little bit slowly in terms of standardization and testing regulations, because of walking that fine line between regulating enough for safety and regulating too much that the cost increases and people start turning back to the black market.
That's a fantastic point, Tracy. And then in terms of trends, I want to look at it. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about sort of the trends in terms of technology and things like that. There's another trend that I find really interesting, which is the trends in terms of how consumers are changing the way they use cannabis and the contexts in which they use cannabis. So as we see different form factors emerge, as we see things like vape cartridges gain popularity in new markets, we're seeing consumers that are starting to interact differently with cannabis than they have before and use it in contexts that they didn't use it before. And that, I think, is really interesting. Cannabis is a super versatile drug. It has all sorts of different both health and just psychological impacts, and has a lot of potential. And it's been really interesting to see how consumers interact with each new product form or each new iteration on these product forms, and how that changes the way they feel about cannabis, the way they use cannabis, and the context for which they're buying cannabis.
Sorry to stop the party here, but we do need to go into our Q&A. So hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Falvo, Director of Community at the Arcview Group. We have a bunch of questions. So as you saw in the chat, if we don't get to these ones today or right now, feel free to join us in the breakout room afterwards, and we'll have the panelists jump on there and answer some more questions. But before we head into the Q&A, we have a short 5-question survey that's going to pop up on your screen. So we'd love to hear from you and have you share your insights on today's discussion, and also let us know what you'd like to see from the Arcview Group next. The survey will stay open until the end of the webinar as well. So let's get into the Q&A. So the very first question, and we have quite a few, so let's go through this, but is the vape hardware the same for tobacco versus cannabis? So maybe David or Derek want to jump in on this?
Yeah, I can jump in on this one. If you were to ask that question 5 or 6 years ago, the answer would be yes. It was very similar to one another. But as THC and CBD has become more streamlined, and as markets have come online and it's become legal, the technology has changed. You typically see a very fluid, light viscosity type e-juice versus a distillate or a live resin, which typically is much thicker in viscosity. So based on that, there's been a lot of changes to the cartridge themselves or the heating technology. Saturation rates are different, aperture sizes are different, really driving for a better experience for THC. Whereas I said 5 years ago, you would see people putting distillate into what would be used for an e-juice. Not giving a good experience, and quite frankly could be harmful because it's not designed to heat up at the rate that THC needs, and it could overheat, actually causing a worse off effect than somebody would have anticipated.
Great, thank you. Derek, did you want to jump in on that too?
No, Dave said it exactly right. And I think Neeraj said something earlier around, precise heating, which we're, trending in the right direction. And that's kind of the way that we need to head towards, especially on the cannabis side, is more precise heating to know exactly, burning of terpenes and different types of extracts. There's so many different types of extracts out there. It's hard to have a one-stop shop when it comes to vape hardware. So the cannabis industry is constantly evolving to try to, get better at, vaporizing extractions. So.
Great, thanks. And this is most likely going to go to Jocelyn. So of the $1 billion in vape sales in California, what percentage would you say comes from hardware, and what percentage comes from the actual cartridges? And anyone else can feel free to jump in, but I think Jocelyn might have the most info on this, perhaps.
Yes, I actually should look this up when I'm in the platform. I mean, it's definitely coming from the cartridges over an all-in-one disposable cartridge. It's, I don't even know the number. I'll look it up in a second and pop it into the chat box, but it's by overwhelming majority, it's coming from cartridges versus all-in-one.
And
yeah, I actually have the report up here. I think it was in 2020, it was only 7.7% was disposable sales. And Q1 2021, it was 9.9%. So slight increase in disposables, but overwhelmingly through cartridges.
Great.
That $1 billion does not include things like tabletop vaporizers and refillable handheld vaporizers that are sold outside of dispensary channels.
Great. Thank you, guys. And then the next one, are there industry manufacturing standards? If not, then doesn't this industry risk ad hoc legislation that makes this investment extremely risky?
I can answer that one too. I mean, it's all over the place with all the different states. And that was the one thing that we were sort of impressing upon, for standardization. And that's why I think a lot of these folks, we're the ones that are collecting a lot of these data. So you have the manufacturers, the operators, and the labs. And that's why I was saying we need to have an open dialogue, because there's so much data that's becoming available live time, that it needs to be shared so that a lot of these protocols get standardized. So that's the problem. So
yeah, if vape manufacturers are not already thinking about this stuff, they need to be thinking about this from, what's going to happen next year, in 2 years, in 5 years. You need to start getting your supply chain, your material source. You need to start testing it. If you're not already doing that, you're behind the ball. Plain and simple.
Yeah, Derek, you're bang on. It starts at each component of the BOM, from, a silicon gasket to a center post, and having the individual test done on each piece, having it tested as a full unit. And that goes right through, tier 3 suppliers, into your factory, into the way you ship it. So there's a lot that needs to be tracked and quite frankly, followed throughout that entire process to be able to deliver something clean and safe.
In terms of the elephant in the room, sustainability. So in terms of disposable and single-use cartridges, can they be recycled or reused or anything like that?
Oh, I'd love to jump in this one real quick. So current vaporizers right now cannot be recycled all at once. They have to be taken apart, and then other things that have to chemically happen to take them apart. So current vaporizers on the market cannot. Loto Labs actually is inventing something that will be different. We're going to be using only 2 materials or 3 materials in a cartridge. So it'll be very different. But I think in the future, things will get more recyclable as materials, as the whole world changes their recycling methodology. I think that's a bigger problem with the vapes being recycled. But as a whole right now, vaporizers cannot be recycled as they are, not as a single full unit, because they have metals, they have plastics, ceramics, lots of things in them.
And it'll be interesting to see. We've actually seen a couple of examples of attempts at spinning up vape cartridge recycling programs. It'll be interesting to see if we see some of that stuff coming from the industry as it matures. I mean, we've seen in things like in the electronics industry, where manufacturers will actually have programs to collect and disassemble and recycle things like iPhones. The Nespresso coffee capsules, Nespresso will send you a bag with a UPS return label that you can fill up and send back to them, and they separate the coffee and the aluminum and turn the coffee into compost and recycle the aluminum. So it'll be interesting to see. I think that sustainability is a really important thing that the industry in general is going to have to grapple with. A lot of the packaging regulations from state to state create an enormous amount of unnecessary packaging waste. So vape recycling, I think, is on a long list of sustainability issues that the industry is going to have to grapple with.
Yeah, I agree. Good point about the packaging, because I do think that's an issue. But from the vape hardware side, we're definitely seeing that trend, especially if you look at the sales data, an overwhelming majority of the segment that's sold into is from 510 cartridges. So, for instance, in Washington, we're seeing nearly 98% of all vape sales are just from 510 cartridges, which you can reuse your battery. I know you might have to dispose of the cartridge, but we're slowly but surely seeing disposables decline a little bit in sales, and that increase in cartridges. But yeah, there definitely needs to be an emphasis on sustainability.
Great, thank you. And then last question, and then like I said, please join our breakout room so we can continue this conversation. But I think, from the consumer end, this is a big one. What is the healthiest way to vape cannabis in 2021? I'm not sure who would like to take that, but feel free. All right, Neeraj, go ahead.
So we do something different. We don't make a wick and a coil. We don't make a ceramic and a coil. We just make an induction, one wick. That's the only thing that heats up in our whole system. This, I'm going to say, from my point of view, is the healthiest way to use a vaporizer, because it cooks, it heats the vapor up on something that you use to cook food on. So it's just so healthy compared to like a wick and coil or a burnt. So the problem, honestly, with the health is that when you turn a vaporizer on its side, or it gets to the end of life, air bubbles form, and these air bubbles on the wick are what on the coil create hotspots. These hotspots get very hot. You create enormous amounts of carbonyls very rapidly. This is the same with tobacco vapes and cannabis vapes. Burns, terpenes, all these horrible effects happen when you get an air bubble. So that's something different with what Loto Labs is doing. I think it's going to be a big part of the future of safety and taste for vaporizers.
Yeah, and I'll layer on to that. Sorry to cut you off there, David. I would say the best answer from my perspective is more general on go through the legal routes. Make sure that you understand where you're purchasing your vape from. Do some research, educate yourself on it versus being forced into the black market and purchasing something for $7 cheaper. That $7, in my personal opinion, isn't worth the risk. And I would definitely gear it to a legal dispensary or an online e-commerce shop, and make sure that you trust the brand. Just like you would with alcohol or something else that you would go and purchase, you would do a bit of research prior. So I'd layer on to what Neeraj is saying there. It's, there's definitely different technologies around heating, but I would boil it down to go to a legal dispensary, go through the proper channels, and that way you at least know that it's been through some of these different standardizations, but it has been through the proper testing to make it onto the shelf.
Yeah, I totally agree. The first and biggest step is to acquire through legal channels. It's also interesting. One of the things that vaping introduces is potential interaction with other materials. So making sure that what you're getting is not contaminated with things like heavy metals or potentially harmful additives in the solution that's being vaped is important. But it's worth noting that just from like a cannabis perspective, there haven't been a lot of studies done on vaping, but we do know there have been quite a few studies done on smoking, and even in very heavy lifelong cannabis consumers, we don't see the cannabis smokers, we don't see the same kinds of lung issues that we see from tobacco smokers. So we don't see the increased lung cancers, throat cancers, those kinds of things, emphysema, other lung-related medical problems from cannabis smoking. So all in all, inhaling cannabis is a significantly safer proposition than inhaling tobacco. And with vaping, just make sure that you understand what are the other things that are being added into the equation apart from cannabis, and are those things safe?
Great. Well, I just wanted to thank everyone on the panel today. That was so informative, and we really just appreciate your help and time on this panel. And thank you also for everyone joining us in the audience. Just a couple announcements. We'd love for you to visit arcviewaccess.com and Arcview social media for all of the latest activities and events at Arcview. And if you haven't yet, download the Q1 2021 Vape Industry Report at greentanktech.com, and it's also been dropped in the chat. And join us for our next town hall, where we will be heading to New York. You likely know that the Empire State legalized recreational cannabis earlier this year, but the rules and regulations are still in the works. We'll be going over what we know, what we don't know, and what to do now if you're looking to apply for a New York license. This town hall will be 2 weeks from today on Thursday, July 8th at 1 p.m. Pacific, 4 p.m. Eastern. We'll also be hosting our next Arcview Access on Thursday, July 22nd. We'll be going over infrastructure challenges you might encounter as a cannabis operator. For example, banking, insurance, and real estate. Our experts will help you navigate these challenges to set your business up for operational success. Registration is open for both of these events, and visit arcviewgroup.com/events to save your spot. And we also want to give a special shout out to Arcview's co-founder, Troy Dayton. Today is his birthday. So happy birthday, Troy. And thank you for founding Arcview and giving us a place to have these great conversations. And additionally, if you'd like to join our breakout session, Nicole has now shared the link to join in our chat, and we'll continue this conversation. So thank you all for joining today. We really appreciate you tuning in, and we'll see you at our next Arcview program. Bye.